Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm your host, Christine Niles. They went singing to their deaths, a group of 16 Carmelite nuns going to the scaffold under the guillotine. Their crime? Being loyal to their Catholic king and country. It's one of the most inspiring stories from the French Revolution. More on that in just a little bit. But first, just a reminder, if you love our programming and want to support what we do, please consider signing up for a $10 a month premium subscription. It helps me to keep doing this program. We offer lots and lots of our content for free, but unfortunately, it's not free for us to produce. It's actually very expensive. So if you love this show, if you love our programming, you want to help us continue to put this out, please go to churchmilitant.com/go premium to help. Again, only $10 a month. That's less than 3 cups of coffee in a month. Thank you so much for your support. On July 17th, 1794, the day after the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, a group of 16 Carmelite nuns were marched solemnly up the scaffold to go to their deaths under the guillotine. Their deaths took place at what was then called Place du Trône Renversé, meaning place of the toppled throne. Now, these Carmelite nuns had been brought there on tumbrils on carts through the streets of Paris, and providentially, they were wearing their religious habits that day, glorious Carmelite habits, and the only reason is because the secular lay clothes that they had been forced to wear prior to that were being washed that day in the prison, and they were rushed out of the prison, couldn't get those clothes because they were being washed, and so they had the only other items of clothes that they had to wear, which were their religious habits, their beautiful Carmelite habits. It was a great testimony to their vocation as they were being brought through the streets of Paris. The only alteration was their head covering had been cut short. Why? To expose their necks to the blade of the guillotine. And as they were being carted through the streets of Paris to their place of execution, they were chanting hymns of praise to God, as well as the Psalms in Latin. For instance, Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, God, in your kindness, in your compassion, blot out my offense. Wash me more and more from my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin." They also intoned the Salve Regina, "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope." And interestingly, a strange silence reigned over the crowd. Now, on execution days, it was normally very raucous, very loud, lots of jeering and cheering and people throwing things at the would-be criminals. But today, an eerie silence reigned as the crowd looked upon this spectacle of 16 habited nuns going to their deaths with perfect serenity, singing chants and hymns of praise to their God. They were all quiet. When the nuns came to the scaffold, they knelt and they intoned the Te Deum, a song of praise to God, before chanting the Veni Creator Spiritus. Let's play just a few seconds of this beautiful chant.
Eris Paracletus, donum Dei altissimi, fons vivus ignis caritas, et spiritualis unctio.
One by one they were killed, and 10 days after their execution, Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror, was executed, and the French Revolution came to an end. There is an undeniable link between the martyrdoms of these 16 Carmelite nuns and the end of the French Revolution. So let's go back a few years. July 14th, 1789. Some mark this as the start of the French Revolution. It was the storming of the Bastille, which was a prison. The storming of the Bastille is celebrated to this day, every July 14th in France, as a national holiday. There are parades, fireworks, all of it. But Catholics who know their history never celebrate this day because it ushered in perhaps the most wicked, most evil time in French history. Let me read to you a quote from Bishop Thomas Tobin of the Diocese of Providence, Rhode Island, in remarks that were published in a local newspaper. The storming of the Bastille and the French Revolution as a whole was a complete abandonment of piety, humility, and goodness. And it was the embrace of pride, hate, and terror. The heralds of the revolution cried for liberty, equality, and fraternity, but in truth, they wanted to replace the true liberty with a license to do as they pleased without the Catholic Church's moral guidance. If we do not learn from the errors promoted by the radicals of the French Revolution, then we might find ourselves making the same mistakes, which are starting to foment within our society today. In a quote from our good friend, Catholic author John Zmirak, Bastille Day marks the beginning of the greatest organized persecution of Christians since the Emperor Diocletian. This day, the beginning of the French Revolution, also planted the seeds for the murderous ideologies of socialism and nationalism that would poison the next 2 centuries, murdering millions of believers and other innocent civilians. And that is no exaggeration. France is considered the eldest daughter of the church, meaning that France was essentially the first Catholic country. Her history, her Catholicism goes back more than 1,000 years. And at the time, she was considered the most Catholic nation in the world. Very long Catholic history. Also, the monarchy had a very close association with the Catholic Church. Robespierre led a virulently anti-Catholic crusade. He essentially headed the sect of the Jacobins, who were rebel rousers. Many of them were Freemasons, hated the Catholic Church. Their motto was the destruction of altar and throne. Altar, meaning Catholic altars, where the priest offers the holy sacrifice of the Mass, confects the Holy Eucharist. Destruction of altar and Catholic throne. Robespierre oversaw the execution of 17,000 people, mostly by guillotine, many of them Catholic clergy, monks, religious, nuns, and lay people. He also helped to lead the war against the Vendée, the war in the Vendée, which some call the first genocide in human history. It wiped out 300,000 people, mostly Catholics, in the Vendée. Lies were spread about the king, King Louis XVI, who helped to finance the American Revolution, but in the process bankrupted his country, which led to a great deal of destitution, poverty, a lot of discontent among the people. Many lies also spread about Queen Marie Antoinette, one of the most maligned figures in history. All the lies about her, let them eat cake, all of that, the movies they put out, total, complete lies. And I encourage you to read a wonderful historical fiction, although much of it is based on reality, on truth, by Elena Maria Vidal, titled Trianon. One of the best books I've ever read. Beautiful book. Read it. Encourage your children to read it. It sets the record straight about Marie Antoinette, who actually died an extremely devout Catholic, died in the state of grace, who was very generous to the poor and very devout. But all sorts of lies were spread about her, both her and the king, in order to foment discontent among the people, in order for the Jacobins to obtain their goal of committing regicide, of killing the king and the queen, a very wicked act. After the anti-Catholic faction takes control, the government issues the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, which essentially orders that all Catholic priests, nuns, monks renounce their ties and loyalty to the Catholic Church and instead pledge allegiance to the state. Many clergy refused. In fact, 75% of the clergy refused to do that. To do that would have been going into schism. It would have been rejecting the church herself, and 75% refused. They would come to be known as refractory clergy or non-juring priests, and many of them went into hiding. They became the hunted, the persecuted. And if they were found out, they would be tortured, imprisoned, many of them executed. But these courageous clergy who went underground ministered to the Catholic population. They would go from house to house, many of them in disguise, offering the sacraments, risking their lives to bring the sacraments to Catholics under the French Revolution. And like I said, many of them were caught, and it meant certain death for those people. And I hope one day that a history of the persecuted clergy, the heroic clergy under the French Revolution, will be made public, because we all know about the hunted persecuted priests during Reformation England. It's something that I'll devote an entire show to, but so much courage, so much heroism among these priests under King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, Bloody Bess, as they persecuted and hunted these Catholic priests during the Reformation, many of them Jesuits, but not just Jesuits, Catholic priests, diocesan priests, religious, risking their lives. St. Edmund Campion, one of the great heroes of the English Reformation, who was tortured, hanged, drawn, and quartered for the faith. So many incredible stories. Same heroic acts by French priests, non-juring priests during the French Revolution, during the Reign of Terror. And their stories deserve to be made known. Just to give you an idea of the wickedness that prevailed under Robespierre's reign, on November 10th, 1793, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, very famous, everybody knows it, Notre Dame Cathedral, was desecrated. Jacobins came in and they performed a pagan ceremony to enthrone the goddess of reason in the cathedral. They desecrated the altar. They brought in prostitutes, some who danced on the altar. There was a sexual orgy inside the church, and they rededicated Notre Dame Cathedral as the Temple of Reason. Completely wicked. And this is what represented the leaders of the French Revolution. It was an entirely anti-Catholic crusade. And that is what modern French historians and individuals will not tell you, either because they're embarrassed by it and they want to whitewash history, or there are a lot of people who simply don't know the history because they weren't taught that. The French Revolution is supposed to be a glorious thing, a time when the Enlightenment triumphed over medieval suspicion and superstition. It was nothing of the sort.
We delivered him to the Department of Corrections.
There is no place in the church for a priest who would harm children.
It was as though he, by his presence and by his exalted position, was embracing the killer.
She came over this way and landed right there, right next to the tree.
The injury tells a tale, and the tale is indisputable.
So into this maelstrom step the Carmelites, who were living a very quiet life, aware of the changes going on outside their convent walls, but not paying too much attention to it. It's not affecting them very much because they were just cloistered Carmelite nuns living their daily lives in peace. Some of them had been nuns for 50 years. But as the saying goes, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Government officials came to visit the Carmelite convent on August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption. And they questioned all of them, asking, do you want to remain religious? Do you want to remain with your vows, with your religious community? Because you have permission under the civil constitution of the clergy to dispense of your vows, to leave. Every single one of them said, we're staying. We're not breaking our vows. We're not leaving. We're staying. In fact, Sister Euphrasie said this, I have made up my mind to go on wearing this habit, even if I have to purchase this joy with my own blood. A number of their responses were documented. In 1792, the guillotine was first erected in a public square in Paris, and it was the talk of the town. In September of that same year, 1,400 people were executed. It's called the September Massacre. Many of the individuals executed were Catholic, non-juring clergy. One of the sites of the worst persecutions of Catholics took place in the city of Nantes, where they would herd up many hundreds of Catholic clergy, bind them, put them on these floating barges, and then sink the barges so that all of them drowned. They also performed a perverse ceremony that they would call Republican marriages, where they would strip Catholic priests and nuns of all their clothing so they were completely naked, bind them each together, put them on these floating barges, and then cause them to drown. And they called them Republican marriages, like I said, in a perverse desecration, mockery of the sacrament of marriage and of the Catholic faith. All over France, many, thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of Catholics died for the faith, died for their loyalty to their faith, to the Catholic Church, to their Catholic king and country, refusing to obey the perverse mandates and dictates of their godless government. That same year, the Carmelites, who had a sense of foreboding about their own destiny, who had the sense that, the premonition that they were eventually going to die one day, offered their lives to God as a sacrifice, quote, in order that the divine peace which Christ has brought to the world may be restored to the church and to the state. They were willing to lay down their lives as a sacrifice to God, as victims, to bring about an end to the reign of terror. They had 2 years essentially to prepare, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And they prayed every day. And by that point, because their convent had been suppressed and they were no longer allowed to continue to practice their faith, and they weren't allowed to wear their religious habits anymore, they were forced to go out and find living quarters elsewhere, and they had to put on secular lay clothes. But they would still meet privately and secretly, regularly, to pray together. So they would still meet over the course of 2 years. They were found out, their meetings were found out, and on June 23rd, 1794, they were arrested and sent to prison under very harsh conditions, where they had to sleep on the bare floor, very cold, given very little food or water, treated harshly. Not allowed to wash their clothes, even though they were soiled, none of that. It was on July 12th that they were transferred to the Conciergerie, which essentially was the waiting place for those who were going to be executed in Paris. And there, they continued to say their prayers together in community, recite the divine office, and they would minister to the sick. July 17th, as their clothes were being washed, they are abruptly taken from their cells and they're transported to a court, a kangaroo court, and tried and then convicted for treason. And as evidence of their treason, the court brings forth an image of King Louis XVI, which had been found hanging on their convent wall, as well as an image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, also hanging on their convent wall. These two pieces of evidence were presented to accuse them of treason, to accuse them of showing loyalty to the king and to the Catholic Church rather than to the state. Imagine that. Imagine that. Being tried and found guilty of treason by your own government because you had a picture of the Sacred Heart on your wall. They were herded into these carts, these tumbrils, and they were brought through the streets of Paris to their place of execution. Today, it's called the Place de la Nation. You can go there and see the spot where they were killed. When they reached the scaffold, the prioress, the mother prioress in charge of all of the nuns, made the decision to go last. And that's because she wanted to be able to bless each nun before she would go up, mount the scaffold, and die. But she also wanted to spare her daughters the pain of having to see each of her sisters being killed. Each nun, from the youngest to the oldest, went one by one to the mother prioress, knelt to receive her blessing, and then mounted the scaffold. And what is amazing is the first one, after she received her blessing, stood up, starts walking up, and then she starts chanting Psalm 117 in song. "O praise the Lord, all ye nations. Acclaim him, all ye peoples. Strong is his love for us. He is faithful forever." And they're chanting this Latin hymn. And the others join in. So you have all 16 chanting this. And so the novice mounts the steps. She goes, she's singing still. She lies down. The blade comes down. And her singing stops. They lose that voice. The next one kneels before the mother prioress, receives her blessing, singing Psalm 117 with the others, lies down, still singing, and then voice is lost once the blade goes down, one by one by one. And so the singing continues to diminish as more and more voices are silenced forever. And then you have Sister of Jesus Crucified. As she is being led up, she turns to her executioners and she says, "I forgive you with all my heart, as I desire forgiveness from God." She's silenced until all you're left with is the lone voice of the mother prioress, still singing praise to God. She mounts the scaffold, the blade comes down, and now the singing has forever stopped. But we know that their singing continues in paradise. And a silence still reigns over the crowd. Their bodies were buried in a mass grave, a sand pit, in a Picpus cemetery. You can go see it today. They were buried with many, many, many hundreds of other bodies, so it's impossible really to recover their bones or their relics or anything like that, but that's where they're buried today. And, as I mentioned, 10 days later, Robespierre was killed. He was executed, he was killed, and the French Revolution came to an end. God accepted their sacrifice. He accepted their oblation. It was a worthy sacrifice that God accepted, because we know that a fundamental truth of Christianity is that the innocent pay for the guilty. That is Christ's life and death summed up in one phrase: the innocent pay for the guilty. Christ offered himself as a sacrifice, an acceptable sacrifice to God to pay for our sins and open to us the gates of heaven. And we are each called to follow the example of Christ. And that's exactly what these Carmelite nuns did. They followed the example of Christ. They offered their own selves as an acceptable sacrifice to God. And God found their sacrifice worthy. He accepted their offer. And he made them the sacrificial lambs to bring an end to the horror and the tragedy of the French Revolution. On May 27th, 1906, the 16 Carmelite martyrs of Compiègne were beatified by the church. The miracles that led to the beatification involved miraculous cures and healings from other Carmelites who were either dying from cancer, tuberculosis, or other grave illnesses. May the example of the blessed martyrs of Compiègne inspire us today, give us hope, give us courage, so that we ourselves can face our own trials and difficulties, and we should also turn to them and ask for their prayers to help our nation. Because like I said, we're seeing these little pockets of persecution coming more and more and more. We see the FBI targeting good pro-life Catholics like Mark Houck and his family under ridiculous pretenses. We see in other countries as well, pro-lifers being arrested simply for praying outside an abortion mill. This evil seems to be encroaching more and more and more, not just on this country, but on other countries as well. Evil never rests. Evil is always looking to devour and to destroy. And one day we ourselves may have to face our own persecutions, maybe even bloody persecutions. We have to be prepared. And we have to have courage, just like those Catholics who had to suffer and in some cases die under the French Revolution, under the Reign of Terror. Blessed Carmelite martyrs of Compiègne, pray for us. Thank you for listening, and in the words of St. Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward boldly.